alive in our hearts and our lives. Grant us ears to hear you speaking to us, calling us to rest, calling us to ministry. We ask in Christ's name and for his sake. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated. Any football fans here?
Roll Tide.
That's not a fan. That's a fanatic. The college football season's about halfway over, and Alabama hadn't lost yet, which is not the case for most of the teams I cheer for and follow. High school football season, at least in Missouri, I think, you're almost to playoff time, right? The regular season's over in a couple weeks, and the playoffs are coming soon. Who knows about the pros? The Kansas City Chiefs seem to play a week and then take a week off, and then play a week and take a week off. And now they've got a real week off, so they will not lose today, nor will they win. The weather is also finally cooling off. Friday night it was in the 40s, what I call football weather, that sort of crisp autumn feeling. But during the first few weeks of the season, the conditioning of the teams was a major concern. I mean, when it's hot and humid, and when is it not hot and humid in Missouri? Well, I guess in December, January maybe. But when it's hot and humid, the kind of intense on-again, off-again exertion of football is so demanding, it's so taxing physically. And part of the conditioning that enables football players to survive and to play well is, in the heat especially, is this intense regimen of physical training that they do. A regimen of running laps, of running wind sprints, of running the stadium steps, if you have a stadium with steps, all to build up endurance. Another important part of conditioning is eating right. Football players consume an enormous amount of food. I mean, high school football players, if they're teenagers, they just consume an enormous amount of food. And you add football onto that, and it's just like pray for parents who have to buy groceries for kids who play football. Most people who know very much about football know the importance of conditioning and of diet. And most of us learn this, or it's reinforced for us if we're listening to news media, either the evening news that does the sports section, or we're watching ball games, or the six of us who still read newspapers. We understand about conditioning and diet, but the news media says less about another very important part of being prepared and able, being conditioned and in shape to play, and that is sleep. Young people have a tendency to think that they can play very, very well on very little sleep. They think they can do everything on very little sleep. But the evidence shows otherwise. Even the Kansas City Chiefs, in their summer training camp at St. Joseph, have lights out at a really relatively very early hour every night. And research is showing again and again, more and more, the importance of the right amount of sleep. Even that helps prevent major diseases, things like diabetes and obesity, to name a few. Research is also showing that in addition to the right number of hours of sleep, all of us, and especially athletes, need times, just downtimes, times to rest, to recuperate, to rebuild their strength, to regain energy, the energy that's demanded in life and in whatever sport an athlete is in. Eating right and rest are not only necessary for athletes and for physical health for all of us, they're also important for spiritual health, as our text makes clear. The verses that we read together make clear the importance of rest for Jesus and for his followers. Now, if you were to go back to chapter 6, if you have your Bible still open and are tired of listening already, you want to jump clear to the beginning of chapter 6 because they have the beheading of John the Baptist, which you shouldn't be reading because there are children in church. But if you go to the beginning of chapter 6, Jesus is sending the 12 disciples out on a mission. And they're to go from village to village, and they're to preach the gospel. They're to cast out demons, and they're to heal the sick. From what we know from the related passage in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, to be precise, We know that they continued their ministry in any village, in any house, as long as they were welcome there. They stayed, he says, go to a village and a house and stay there till they kick you out. And then you go on to another place. And if they don't even welcome you at all, you just keep on going from village to village. And the text says that at another point, you will not have gone through all the villages and all the places of the people of Israel until the Son of Man comes. Verse 30 tells us then that when the disciples returned, they gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. In other words, this is the report on the mission trip. Does this church take mission trips? Some is it on Sunday night or Sunday morning? Sometime after the trip, is there a report? Good. Yeah. Well, that's where we are in our text in verse 30 and 31. They've gathered around and they've come back from the trip and they are reporting to Jesus all the things they've done and all the things they've taught. Your pastor can tell you that preaching 3 services on a Sunday is exhausting work. There is a physical thing that happens to a preacher, a letdown, a collapse of energy that a preacher experiences either late Sunday evening or on Monday. And some are cursed to experience it both, Sunday night and all day Monday. After that constant flow of adrenaline that keeps you going all Sunday, when that's all done, there's just down. I think doctors experience a similar feeling at the end of a day of intense dealing with people and making life and death decisions in the healing of people. The disciples returned from a mission of preaching and healing, the mission Jesus had sent them on, and their energy is depleted. Though it appears they weren't even aware of that. Jesus, however, recognized it. Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while, he tells them in verse 31. But the mission trip had been exhausting, and when they returned, the work of ministry did not slow down one bit. The text goes on, many were coming and going, and it says the disciples did not even have an opportunity to eat. The version I read said did not have leisure to eat. I think that's a bit misleading. The Greek word just simply, they didn't have time. They didn't have a chance. They didn't have an opportunity. There was no spare moment to eat. Notice the connection between eating and resting that's in the text. I think we tend to separate eating from resting in our world, in our lives. But the culture of the biblical world, there were no fast food restaurants. Well, they couldn't have left at 6 from Kansas City in the morning anyway and gotten down here in time for the first service and stopped to get breakfast at McDonald's. There were no microwaves to get a meal, in 30 seconds or a minute and 30 seconds or how many times you have to push that repeat button to do your meal. None of that could happen. To eat required a long process of food preparation. And in the hot climate of the biblical world, because there was no air conditioning, in that hot climate, you couldn't just eat a big meal and then go right back outside and you go into hard, demanding physical work, or you'd get sick. Even though the women did all the work in meal preparation in that world, men would take several hours to eat and to then rest and to digest following the meal. When the work of ministry was so intense that the disciples did not even have time to eat, Jesus called time out and took the disciples to a deserted place to rest. And verse 46 shows us that Jesus also needed time alone to rest and to pray, to renew his physical energy and his relationship with the Father. So the need for rest was both for the disciples and for Jesus. Because Jesus knew that he and his disciples needed time away to rest, it is easy for us to apply this text to the need for rest from the pressures of ministry. I think that's a valid and an important application. The church where the Morgans and the Hahns attend regularly, Kansas City First Church, we're halfway through a 12-week sabbatical that the board granted our pastor late this summer. In fact, Melinda, I think, does lots of the arrangements of services, and at least talking to folks and working the order with them. Okay? I had one guy in the church complain to me about this. He said, I never got a sabbatical. What are we giving him a sabbatical for? Well, I happen to know, he's retired. I happen to know he had an 8-to-5 job when he worked. He worked 5 days a week. 4.5 he took off the golf day every day. He never was called in the middle of the night to go to the hospital. He was never called in the middle of the night because somebody's spouse had left him. He never had funerals that he had to arrange or be with a family when someone they loved had died. And he had never spent hours every week in the presence of God trying to discern what God was wanting to say to the church and to trying to figure out then words to use to explain, to express the meaning that he understood God wanting communicated to the church. And so he complained. We have a fairly large number, don't we, of retired pastors and former pastors at our church. And I noticed that at least none of them that talked to me complained one bit about this. They all rejoiced for our pastor. I'm one of those former pastors, and I was delighted that our church had taken this step of faith to provide the time and the space for our pastor to experience renewal of vision, renewal of energy to do the work of God. But as he's called, a senior pastor, senior pastors aren't the only ones in ministry who need a rest. Most associate pastors work as hard as the senior pastor. I couldn't tell from the early service if that's true here. John seemed to think it was true, that associate pastors work just as hard as the senior pastor. Though the associates generally don't have that constant pressure every week of needing to hear from God and to speak for God, which, when you've never done that, it's hard to explain what that burden is, what that feels like, and the pressure it is. But we need to give attention to providing times of rest, of renewal for all of our church staff that carries the load of ministry. But the pastoral and the office staff of the church are not the only ones knee-deep in the work of ministry. Every church that I know about stands or falls on the faithful, consistent work of lay volunteers. Sunday school teachers, nursery workers. I can't quite imagine what would have happened if God had called me to be a nursery worker. Oh, I can imagine. There's a book in the Bible about it. It's called Jonah. He ran. That's what I would have done. Yeah. Youth workers, children's ministry workers, worship arts, as it's called at our shop. Worship arts volunteers, a host of all kinds of other roles, of people involved week after week after week involving service and leadership and time and energy. In most churches, the lay people who work in children's ministries are highly stressed. One of the churches we came from when I was in Oklahoma, in Bethany, they had them do once a month because they didn't think they would survive doing 2 Sundays in a row with some of the kids in that church. And I served a 1-week term and decided that was a good plan. And I asked the DS for some more preaching engagements out and about. We lose people to lay ministry, and eventually lose people to the church. When they burn out, working week after week after week in secular jobs, and then coming from that job and working hour after hour after hour in church ministry volunteer work. Jesus understood that the disciples needed rest. We cannot be followers of Jesus today and refuse to recognize that the people who serve Christ today, day in, day out, week after week, also need rest and renewal. Now, part of our problem is that in most churches, 20% of the people do 80% of the work. And I think that's probably not true here in Carthage, Nazarene, because there was more than 20% of the folks serving donuts and coffee and stuff when I came in this morning. At least that many people greeted me. So you've got 30% greeters maybe or more in this church. Way to go. Another part of the problem is that church in America has become commercialized. It's a consumer product. It's not a pattern of following Jesus in discipleship and becoming like Christ. Because many, many people regard church as a product for them to consume. So they shop for the best deal in children's ministry and the best deal in youth ministry and the best music ministry and whoever knows what else kind of thing they're looking for. And some of them will choose one church for children's ministry and then they'll shift over to another and for youth ministry and they'll shift to another and once a month for the worship ministry. Getting more and giving less is how we define a good deal. And there's lots of folks looking for a good deal in church these days. That's reality in church in America, and almost all of you know that. But that is not the way of Jesus. If we're to become obedient stewards of the health, the time, the energy of those people who do the work of the church, we need to figure out how to get either more people involved or do less programming. We've got to find a way to talk through this and treat folks as not an inexhaustible resource. Because if we don't solve this issue, we're going to wear people out, and someday we'll lose the church as we know it because of that. But, so much for the good news. Our text is also clear that doing nothing is not the only way to rest and renewal. It's not even the best way to rest and renewal. Though Jesus tried to take his disciples away to a deserted place for a retreat, a rest, a great crowd of people thwarted his purpose. I hope you're not offended by me saying people can thwart Jesus' purpose. They do it all the time. There's some folks did that this morning when they decided not to come to church. They thwarted the purpose that Jesus had for them. So this crowd of people thwarted his purpose. The crowd saw Jesus and the disciples get into a boat to go away. On the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee is about 7 miles long and about 4 miles wide, and except when it's cloudy or foggy in the morning, you can see from any part of the shore to any other part of the shore almost. So they watch this boat take off. They know he's going to get away from them, and they just start running around the edge of the lake, and they run faster than Jesus and the disciples could row. And by the time he arrives at where he's going, the crowd that he had been ministering to, that he left to get away from, is all there waiting on shore for him to come off the boat and to minister to them again. Now, the general outline of this story of feeding the 5,000 is so familiar to many of us from childhood Bible stories, we don't notice what the text says, which is, frankly, one of the problems of doing children's church Bible studies and then never doing adult intensive kind of level of the study of Scripture and actually reading the text and discovering how one gospel has it different than another gospel in a similar kind of story. By the way, for a piece of junky information that will not get you to heaven, but that I will not forget until I'm deep, deep into Alzheimer's, the only miracle mentioned in all 4 Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000. I know that because I didn't know that on my oral comprehensive exam to graduate from seminary. And when I couldn't answer it, Dr. Earl said, "Tee-hee-hee, I was just looking for something you didn't know." And by doing that, he cursed me with remembering it forever. And I can hardly talk about and mention the feeding of the 5,000 without remembering. This is the only miracle in all 4 Gospels. Well, I think I would have been very frustrated if I were to have taken my staff to a retreat place to rest and to have discovered that the people we were needing a break from had traveled faster than we did and got to the retreat center before we did, and they were waiting there to be ministered to once again as soon as we got out of our cars at the retreat center. But Jesus did not react out of frustration. What our text tells us is that when Jesus saw the crowd that had run around the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Now, there's several things just in that little verse and a half that we need to recognize and talk about. First, there's a deeper motivation for ministry than simply human needs. The fact that people need ministry, the fact that ministers need rest, is an important reason to provide that ministry and to provide that rest. But it's not the most important reason. The most important reason, the deepest reason, is the compassion of Jesus, the love of God. Jesus understands that God created us to thrive. He understands that God created us to be healthy. He understands that God created us to serve others. But God also created us to provide such service to others out of a heart of love, rather than simply because someone needs our ministry. And there are folks in vocational ministry and in volunteer church work who continue on working and doing what they do because they need to be needed. And they're looking for that sense of, You're so important to me, Pastor. Or you're so important to me, music director. Or you're so important to me, children's worker. Rather than it flowing out of compassion and genuine love, the love that God would put there. So people in need, including people in need of rest, need love and they need compassion even more than they need the rest, or whatever form of ministry we might be trying to provide for them. All ministry, all rest, ultimately proceeds from a heart of love, or it's neither ministry nor rest. And it meets the greatest human need of all, which is the need to be loved. Well, the second little piece in that verse and a half, Jesus saw the people in need as sheep without a shepherd. Now, I learned from the first service that there's not a lot of sheep in this part of the state. It was mostly dark when I drove down, so I wouldn't know, but this looks like cattle country to me. Besides, Dorothy had an uncle who was over by Richland, who told me that there were more cattle in Missouri than any other state in the Union, which I didn't believe him. So I looked it up in the almanac, and he was right, which is quite frustrating. Nevertheless, sheep and shepherds were a very important part of the biblical world. If you were to travel in the Holy Land today, once you get out of the big cities and you go through the countryside, you will see flocks of sheep and goats, and there will be shepherds behind them or in front of them, depending on where they're headed and what they're doing. Okay? And sheep and shepherds were a very important part of the Old Testament's understanding of God himself and of God's people. I got in trouble earlier with this question, but I'll try it again anyway. How many of you have heard of Psalm 23? I see. I've got more hands in this crowd than in the 9 o'clock crowd. You guys are spiritual people. Good. Yeah. Most of us know that Psalm 23, most of us that know Psalm 23, know that the psalm begins with the claim, the Lord is our shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, right? I shall not want. He makes us lie down in green pastures. He leads us by still waters. In the next line, he restores our souls, which is the very language of the rest and renewal we've been talking about in this passage of Scripture. This beautiful and well-known psalm describes then that kind of rest and that kind of renewal that all of us need from time to time. And it makes it very, very clear that in the final analysis, the ultimate and only source of that kind of rest and renewal is God himself. Now, something that most of us don't realize is how often the Old Testament described Israel, the people of God, as the sheep of God or the flock of God, and God as their shepherd. One of the most detailed passages you can find that does that is Ezekiel 34, which if you can't sleep this afternoon, you can read that chapter. It'll help you understand sheep and shepherds anyway. Both Jeremiah and Ezekiel not only describe Israel as sheep, the flock of God, they also describe the leaders, the kings of Israel, as shepherds. Shepherds whom God provided to Israel to do for the people of God what God promised he would do as their shepherd. That is to say, the kings were understood by the prophets to be agents of God, acting on behalf of God in the ministry of shepherding the people of God, the flock of God, the sheep. So, the prophets anyway didn't think political leaders had the right to accumulate power and wealth for themselves. In their mind, the function of political leaders was to serve in God's stead, to shepherd God's people. In fact, Ezekiel 34, if you were to read it all this afternoon, it declares that because the political leaders of Israel were only interested in themselves and were gathering stuff for themselves, taking advantage of people. In fact, you could paraphrase one of the chapters, one of the paragraphs, they were fleecing the flock. Okay? Because of that, Ezekiel says God is going to bring judgment on those kings, and that judgment will happen in two different ways. One, they will be taken into exile and captivity, and the nation will be destroyed, and their dynasty, their kingship, their inheritance of kingly family will be broken, and there will be no more king. Except, the second part, God himself will come to be the true king, the true shepherd, and that he will once again be the authentic true shepherd of his people. If you read John 10, I am the good shepherd. You see that Jesus understood himself to be the fulfillment of that prophecy from Ezekiel chapter 34. Jesus saw himself as the shepherd for a people who had no shepherd. And he calls on his people, his church, to do the same. Okay? Do you know the name Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Yeah, the 9 o'clock crowd did pretty good on that question. And everybody's nodding now that you know better than the 9 o'clock crowd. Good, yeah. Bonhoeffer, if you haven't had the privilege of learning about him, was a Christian martyr killed by Hitler for resisting the Nazi regime and the killing of the Jews during World War II. Bonhoeffer had this description of the plight of people without a shepherd. There were questions, but no answers. Distress, but no relief. Anguish of conscience, but no deliverance. Tears, but no consolation. Sin, but no forgiveness. Commentary I read quoted those words, and the author went on, David Garland went on to say, they were waiting for good news, and all they got was good advice. Does that sound like anybody you know? If not, your circle of acquaintances is too small. Bonhoeffer and Garland have described thousands of people in this very town. People who need shepherds from this church. People who need to discover Jesus, the true rest, the truth Sabbath, which, by the way, is one of the reasons we worship on Sunday. They need to discover Jesus as the shepherd, as the rest for their lives. If we're to be Christ in the world, then we, the church, must also be the rest, the shepherds, for people who are in great need. And it will happen person by person as we connect with them, enter into their lives, and provide the care of a shepherd in the midst of their pressure-packed and harassed lives. Third, this verse and a half tells us that Jesus began to teach them many things. Now, I am sure that many of them needed healing. Many of them needed food. Some of them needed work. Some of them needed clothing. All of them needed to be saved. But before engaging in any of those needs, trying to meet any of those needs, the text says Jesus began teaching them. And I'm interested that he did not preach. He began to teach them. He did not preach at them, telling them how sinful they were. He did not preach at them, telling them they needed to do this and this and this if they wanted to be saved. He began to teach them. And the text doesn't tell us what he taught them, but I know, because the rest of the New Testament tells us. He taught them that God is love. And he taught them that both by his words and by the actions of his life and his ministry with them. He taught them that God is gracious, that God is forgiving, that God is kind. And he taught them that both by his words and by the actions of his life and his ministry among them. He taught them that God was able to supply all of their needs and to bring order and meaning to the hectic, disorganized, chaotic, and desperate lives. And he taught them that both with words and by the actions of his life and ministry among them. He taught them a way of life in which they could love and serve each other, and in turn be loved and be served by each other. And he taught them that both in words and in the actions of his life and his ministry among them. And part of God's plan to provide shepherds for the people of Carthage, Missouri, who are sheep without a shepherd, part of God's plan is for a church that will patiently teach these people about God's love, God's grace, God's forgiveness, God's kindness, God's sufficient and abundant supply, and God's loving community of people. And that will teach them patiently by words and patiently by lives and ministry among them. Well, we need to finish the story. And again, knowing the story from children's Bible studies may cause us to miss the flow. So follow the flow. Verse 35, when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat. Notice, the disciples recognized that the people were in need, so they wanted to get rid of them. Do we ever do that? Most of the time. These people have tremendous problems. They should go somewhere and get some help. That means they should go somewhere else and get some help. But Jesus answered them, you give them something to eat. And the Greek text is extremely emphatic in its construction. You disciples, you give them something to eat. Jesus seems to expect his people to provide for the needs around us, rather than sending those needy people away to fend for themselves. Notice the response of the disciples. Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? 200 denarii represented about 7 months' worth of wages. So Jesus tells the disciples to feed the crowd, and their immediate response is, we can't afford to do that. We haven't got enough money. How often is that the response that we make in the life of the church? Now, I'm sure the disciples didn't have 7 months of wages in their pockets. And I only see 2 or 3 of you that I suspect have enough money to feed all of Carthage and meet their needs. But notice what Jesus said. He says, go and feed them. We haven't got enough money. So he asked them what they had. What are the resources that are available to you? Well, it took them some time to research, but before long they came back with their inventory. 5 loaves and 2 fish. You couldn't feed 50 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, let alone 5,000 people. But Jesus commanded the disciples to organize the crowd into food service, to sit down in orderly fashion, not the haphazard way of outdoor church picnics, but like you do in the gym when you really got to get all the tables in the right spots to get room for everybody. Organize them to receive a meal. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. I'm kind of a math nut, but I didn't do my homework, sorry. What is 5 and 2 divided by 5,000? I mean, what's that? 1,000th of a loaf of bread for each person. So what would that be? 2,500th of a piece of fish for 5 per person for 5. That's assuming just 5,000 people, and lots of folks think it's 5,000 men plus women plus children. I mean, there'd be tiny, tiny, tiny crumbs, smaller than the communion wafers we serve. Huh? But verse 42 says, all ate and were filled. And they took up more leftovers than the food they had to start with. One of the words used throughout church history to describe this miracle is the multiplication of the loaves. I have no idea how Jesus did it. I'm old enough now to not even worry that I don't have any idea about how he did it. But when we don't have enough, but when we give what we have and we begin to do what Jesus wants us to do, there's always enough. Some of you need to hear that. When we don't have enough, but we give what we do have and we begin to start doing what Jesus wants us to do, there will always end up being enough. And the Greek word in verse 42 is, they were filled. It's the same Greek word we find in the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who are hungry, for they will be filled. But that Greek word means more than just being full. It means being satisfied. Some lexicons, Greek dictionaries, have satiated. It means they don't want any more because they've got enough and they're content and everything is just fine because they are satisfied with what they've received. Some of you are here today exhausted. You've been serving the Lord for a long time without any rest or renewal, so long that you are now living on spiritual fumes. Some of you are here today because you desperately need the love, the grace, the kindness, the forgiveness, the supply of God. And you were hoping if you came here today, maybe it would be here today. All of you are here today because God knows of harassed and broken people that he wants you to shepherd. Some of you are saying, I need help. I'm not ready to give help. The Lord can provide the help, and as soon as he does, he expects you to share. But none of us has enough to be the shepherd for those sheep without a shepherd. All of us are here today because in some form or fashion we are hungry. And the good news of the gospel is, blessed are those who are hungry, for they will be satisfied. Thanks be to God.